how much awareness was there contemporaneously, at the least on the left, and I'm curious actually on the right too. How much was this new, I guess, structure, this new narrative that had been largely adopted by the elites in both parties? In fact, I think I just did an interview, and I think we're going to be playing it next week about polarization. That in that era, the biggest complaint was that there was not enough polarization. That we had two parties who were basically so aligned that, this was the articulated complaint of like the establishment media at the time.
Yeah. So what I'd say is, the key thing that's noteworthy is that you had growing agreement among national elites, but that didn't actually necessarily dovetail with mass public opinion or varieties of popular politics that persisted, both in the South with like a kind of built-in white supremacist politics, but also with various types of left formations. And just as like an example, so, I've been doing work on American views of the Constitution. This is something that's sort of central to the book that I'm writing. And you have Gallup polls going back to the 30s about, assessing, do Americans like their Constitution? Do they think it should be fundamentally changed? The period where you have a flip, there are more Americans saying in these polls that the Constitution should be fundamentally restructured than not, is like right after World War II. It's December 45. And the basic thought is that you actually have a majority of citizens that are thinking, well, maybe we should have fairly significant changes to the economy, and that might mean structural changes to the Constitution.
Can I just? I just want to stick a flag in here and say how, for someone who, when I was 9 or 10 years old, was brought to see the Constitution that was going around in a train, around the country, the idea,
freedom trains.
Yes, the idea that there was a period within the 20th century where Americans were down on the Constitution. It's just, I think it's a little bit mind blowing. I mean, I've been reintroduced to that notion as an adult, but like for that entire period of time, the Constitution was like, and I think many people probably in this country still feel this way. It was like it's like the Bible, like a document that was just so pristine and perfect. I mean, how else would we all be here? It really is sort of stunning.
But, part of what I'm arguing is that was a conscious product of, of policies generated by elites to reshape how people viewed the institutions of government. And that fit in real ways with the experiences people had. Like wealth, again, was being generated. People were being included. Rights were being protected in the way that they hadn't been previously. But, you just go back to the 30s. The classic position among African Americans within the labor movement was that was to think of the Constitution as a document for, basically providing the instruments of decision making, like, how government operates. And in those terms, it was really weak. So, these views don't just disappear. But what I want to say is that they really get suppressed. And they get suppressed in ways that we forget. Like, so I mentioned in the piece, when Johnson is running for president in 1964, this is a different era of the primary system. But he realizes that, who's probably the most popular Democratic alternative at this point? It's George Wallace. And so how is it that you keep, he's like, I'm going to win the nomination. Like, that's not the problem. But how do I keep there from being a significant, primary fight? And, it's a different era. So what his idea is that you have, in each state where Wallace is contesting the primary, you have a really popular local politician on the ballot instead of Johnson. And that local politician wins the state and then pledges his delegates, because, again, this is the 60s in the U.S. and it's a him, but pledges his delegates to Johnson. But that's a function of realizing the power of these contested views. And you can tell the same story about the left. So in 68 and 64, you have really robust left politics that maintains a kind of historical memory with the 30s. You have the Mississippi Democratic Party that, like the politics of the 30s, sees, well, what's the point of racial reform in the U.S.? It's a project to truly democratize the institutions of state and governance. That's why it's called a freedom party. And so that operates even in the language of like SDS and the student movement and elements of the labor movement. So all of this persists, and it pops up at various moments, and then it basically gets suppressed. And to me, like in many ways, the real break when it comes to our historical memory is post 89, because what the collapse of the Soviet Union does is it almost renders all of those conversations. So if elites really had to confront disagreement and figure out ways to contain it, like post 89, all of those conversations now seem like antiquated and moot. Talking about alternatives to capitalism, or the need for revolutionary change when it comes to race, or challenging American Cold War foreign policy, that in a way it's beside the point, because victory just proves the goodness of the market, the justice of limited racial reforms, and the appropriateness, whatever the problems at the margins, of U.S. international interventionism during the Cold War.
So the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union is both a victory and a confirmation that we're on the right track. Everything we're doing is working, and also probably adds a little bit of like, and now where else are you going to go? We're the only game in town.
Totally. And one of the things that it does, so this is where, we might not have time to get into all the specifics of it, but when we think about like the rise of neoliberalism, so when Cold War ideas get reformed in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, in the context of all of these, there are economic crises, there's foreign policy crises, there's racial crises, that the new version really is, a kind of market politics stripped of all of the old elements of social democracy that actually gave ethical substance, legitimacy to the compact in the first place. The reason why people accepted the bargain is because you got certain tangible benefits like Social Security and unemployment insurance and collective bargaining. But the version of like the Cold War agreement that emerges post 89 is a version stripped of all of that. And it's a hardcore commitment to privatization and austerity. It's a belief that like basically any social problem. So I don't know that we both remember the 90s. Basically, you throw a dart at the wall, and if the wall has a social problem, you just solve it through some kind of market solution. School choice, vouchers, privatizing prisons, like you name it.
The era of big government is over. Welfare reform, Telecommunications Act. So.